"Is this some kind of joke? Are you deaf, old man?" The voice was sharp, brittle with the unearned confidence of a brand-new butter bar. Lieutenant Davis, barely 24 and consumed by the importance of his freshly pinned rank, stood with his hands on his hips, his uniform so crisp it looked like it could cut glass. He glared at the old janitor, a man who seemed to have been eroded by time itself, his gray coveralls faded to the color of a washed-out sky. The old man, Jedediah, didn't flinch. He just continued his slow, methodical sweeping near the hangar bay, his movements economical and deliberate. The air on the forward operating base was thick with heat, and the fine, red dust that got into everything. It was a miserable, gritty existence, and the imminent arrival of a two-star general had frayed every nerve on the flight line. The primary landing pad, a large white circle painted on the tarmac, was coated in a fresh layer of this insidious red powder from a sudden squall that had blown through an hour earlier. It looked like the surface of Mars, and it was Lieutenant Davis's problem. "I gave you an order, Janitor," Davis snapped, his voice rising. "I said clean that pad. Now. The general's bird is 20 minutes out. Do you understand the words coming out of my mouth?" Jedediah paused his sweeping. He didn't look at the lieutenant directly, not at first. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, scanned the perimeter. He noted the heat shimmering off the asphalt, the position of the fire suppression vehicles, the two MPs standing listlessly by a Humvee. It was a subconscious habit, cataloging threats and assets, as natural to him as breathing. Finally, he turned his gaze to the young officer. His face was a road map of wrinkles, but his eyes were clear and steady. "That won't work, sir," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. It wasn't defiant. It was a statement of fact, as simple and solid as a rock. The simplicity of it infuriated Davis more than any argument could have. The lieutenant took a half-step closer, puffing out his chest. He was a good 6 inches taller than the stooped old man, a fact he used to his full advantage. "Won't work? I'm a commissioned officer in the United States Air Force, and I am telling you to take that broom and sweep that dust. Your job is to clean. That pad is dirty. It's not a complicated equation." He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at the red circle. A few airmen, tasked with setting up a small reception canopy nearby, paused their work to watch the confrontation. Public humiliation was a spectator sport, and the lieutenant seemed eager to put on a show. Jedediah's gaze followed the pointing finger to the landing pad, then back to the lieutenant's furious face. He sighed, a soft exhalation of breath that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "The dust is too fine, Lieutenant," he explained, his tone patient like a grandfather teaching a child something fundamental. "You kick that up with a broom. You create a particulate cloud. When the helicopter comes in, the turbine engines will suck that dust right in. It's abrasive. It'll coat the turbine blades, disrupt the airflow, and could cause a compressor stall. Or worse, a flameout on approach. You don't clean that with a broom. You need a low-pressure, high-volume water truck to wet it down and wash it away." He spoke with an unnerving certainty, the kind of certainty that comes not from reading a manual, but from seeing the consequences firsthand. The technical precision of the explanation only enraged Lieutenant Davis further. It was insubordination wrapped in the language of expertise, and it made him look foolish. "I am not going to be lectured on engine maintenance by a janitor," he spat. "I don't care if you have to lick it clean. You will follow my order. Clean that pad now, or I will have you arrested for interfering with military operations. Is that clear enough for you?" From a short distance away, Master Sergeant Hayes watched the scene unfold with a practiced, weary eye. He'd seen 1,000 young lieutenants like Davis, full of piss and vinegar, their authority a fragile shell they protected with bluster and threats. Hayes was in charge of the ground crew for the general's arrival, and technically the lieutenant was his superior for this specific task. But Hayes answered to a higher authority. 30 years of experience. Something about the old janitor held his attention. It wasn't just his unnatural calm in the face of the officer's tirade, it was his posture. Beneath the worn coveralls and the slight stoop of his shoulders, there was a coiled stillness, an economy of motion that spoke of discipline etched into muscle memory. While the lieutenant was a frantic bundle of nervous energy, the old man was a study in absolute control. Hayes's eyes narrowed. He saw the way the janitor's head was on a constant, subtle swivel, his gaze never resting on one spot for too long, always cataloging, assessing. It was the same kind of hyper-awareness Hayes had seen in seasoned combat veterans, particularly the quiet professionals from the special operations community. Then he saw it. As the old man shifted his weight, the cuff of his coveralls rode up just enough to expose a small faded tattoo on the inside of his wrist. It was barely a smudge of gray-blue ink, almost invisible against the sun-weathered skin. But to Hayes, it was like a flare in the dark. It wasn't a unit patch he recognized, not from any conventional force. It was something older, more esoteric. A winged dagger, perhaps, with a shape that hinted at a spectral figure. It was the kind of marking whispered about in smoke pits and late-night bull sessions, a symbol from a forgotten chapter of military history. A ghost marker. Hayes felt a jolt of recognition, not of the specific symbol, but of the type of man who would bear it. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him despite the oppressive heat, that Lieutenant Davis was making a catastrophic mistake. "I'm done talking!" Lieutenant Davis shouted, his face now a blotchy red. The threat of arrest hadn't worked. The old man was still just standing there, broom in hand, an island of infuriating calm. "This is a direct order. Pick up your broom and march." He took another step forward, violating the old man's personal space, trying to intimidate him with proximity. Jedediah didn't move a muscle. He just held the lieutenant's gaze, and for the first time, Davis saw something in those pale blue eyes that wasn't deference or fear. It was a deep, profound weariness, mixed with something that looked almost like pity. It was the look of a man who had seen real monsters and found this little display of authority to be profoundly unimpressive. The pity was the final straw. "That's it," Davis yelled, his voice cracking. "I'm calling the MPs. You're done. You're going to spend the night in a cell and be off this base by morning." He reached for the radio on his belt, his hand shaking with adrenaline and fury. The airman who had been watching now looked distinctly uncomfortable. This had gone from a simple dressing down to something much uglier. Master Sergeant Hayes took a half step forward, ready to intervene. He didn't know who the old man was, but he knew he was about to witness a monumental act of foolishness. He opened his mouth to speak, to try and de-escalate, to tell the young lieutenant to stand down and let him handle it. But before he could utter a single word, a new sound cut through the air, drowning out the lieutenant's angry shouts and the ambient hum of the base. It was the rhythmic, percussive thumping of helicopter blades, but it wasn't the sound of the general's approaching transport. This was deeper, heavier, more menacing. It was the sound of a purpose-built war machine. A shadow fell over the tarmac as a Sikorsky HH-60 Pave Hawk, painted a flat, non-reflective black, roared into view. It wasn't the polished VIP transport they were expecting. This was a special operations bird, bristling with antennas, sensors, and a minigun mounted by the side door. Instead of heading for the dusty landing pad, it banked sharply and settled onto a clear patch of asphalt 100 yards away, its rotor wash kicking up a storm of its own. The side door slid open before the skids had even fully touched down. A man in a flight suit and tactical gear, a Pararescueman, or PJ, by his maroon beret, jumped out. He wasn't looking at the waiting reception party or the flustered lieutenant. His eyes were scanning the area with an intense, focused energy. Then his gaze locked onto the old janitor. The PJ's jaw went slack. He froze mid-stride, his expression a mixture of shock, disbelief, and something that looked like pure, unadulterated awe. He ripped off his helmet, his voice cutting through the whining down of the turbines like a bullhorn. "Spectre! Holy hell, is that you?" The name echoed across the flight line. A single, strange word that carried an impossible weight. Jedediah, who had been watching the helicopter land with a familiar, almost fond expression, finally turned his head fully toward the PJ. A small, sad smile touched the corners of his lips. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The PJ broke into a wide grin and started jogging toward him, shouting to his crew still inside the chopper. "It's him! It's Spectre! Command said he was fishing in Montana!" The entire flight crew, pilot and co-pilot included, now leaned out of their windows, staring at the old man in the faded janitor's uniform as if they were looking at a living monument. Lieutenant Davis stood frozen, his hand hovering over his radio, his mouth hanging open. The world had just tilted on its axis. Janitors did not have call signs, especially not call signs that made a battle-hardened special operator look like he'd just seen a ghost. The PJ reached Jedediah and, without a moment's hesitation, snapped to the most rigid, respectful position of attention Davis had ever seen. His heels clicked together on the asphalt. "Spectre," the PJ said, his voice thick with emotion. "Sir, it's an honor." He didn't offer a handshake. He rendered a slow, deliberate salute. It was a gesture of profound respect, the kind a soldier gives not to rank, but to legend. From the cockpit of the Pave Hawk, a voice crackled over the base-wide radio frequency, overriding all other traffic. It was the pilot, his tone stripped of all casual chatter, replaced by a formal, reverent cadence. All stations, this is Black Knight 01. Be advised, we have eyes on Spectre. I repeat, we have a positive identification of Spectre. Ground control, the legend is on your tarmac. All other air traffic, hold your positions." A ripple of confusion and awe spread through every person on the flight line who wore a headset. The name meant nothing to most, but to the pilots, the air traffic controllers, and the special tactics operators, it was the equivalent of discovering a forgotten god walking among them. Master Sergeant Hayes felt a cold thrill run down his spine. Spectre. The name unlocked a dark corner of his memory, a story he'd heard as a young airman from a grizzled old chief who had served in Vietnam. A ghost. A combat controller who worked with SOG teams. So deep in the shadows he was never officially there. A man who could call down lightning from the sky with a whisper into a radio. A man credited with saving entire companies. A man who had vanished from the records after the war. The Pave Hawk's crew chief had now disembarked and was walking briskly toward the bizarre scene. He was a mountain of a man with a weathered face and the same look of utter reverence as the PJ. He saw Lieutenant Davis's stunned expression and the broom lying near Jedediah's feet. He put two and two together instantly. He stopped in front of the lieutenant, his eyes hard as stone. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice dangerously low. "What exactly was happening here?" Davis stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence. The pad was dirty. He wouldn't—" The crew chief cut him off. "You see that man?" he said, nodding toward Jedediah, who was now quietly talking with the PJ. "That man is Jedediah Calloway. In my community, and in the community of anyone who has ever been truly saved by air power, we know him by another name, Spectre. He was one of the original, quiet professionals. Before there were PJs and CCTs as we know them today, there was him. He spent years in places that don't exist on maps, with a radio on his back and the entire United States Air Force at his fingertips. He was a master of directing close air support in the most hellish conditions imaginable." As he spoke, a flicker of memory, sharp and violent, flashed through Jedediah's mind. Not a memory of glory, but of terror. The smell of cordite and jungle rot that deafening roar of an A-1 Sky Raider's cannons just feet above the canopy, the desperate screams of wounded men in his ear, and his own voice, impossibly calm, speaking coordinates into a handset as green tracers ripped the air around him. Spectre to Sky King, danger close. I say again, danger close. Put it right on my smoke. He blinked, the vision gone as quickly as it came, leaving only the dull ache of old wounds in the bright, hot sun of the present day. The crew chief continued, his words hitting Lieutenant Davis like physical blows. That man has forgotten more about air operations, engine tolerances, and staying alive than you will ever learn, sir. The reason he told you not to sweep that dust wasn't because he was lazy. It's because he probably saw a dozen helicopters go down in Southeast Asia from that exact kind of fine, abrasive dust. He wasn't being insubordinate. He was trying to save your general's multi-million-dollar aircraft and maybe his life. He let the words hang in the hot, silent air. The entire flight line was now watching. The MPs had drifted closer, their expressions bewildered. The airmen setting up the canopy had completely stopped working, their eyes wide. Lieutenant Davis's face had gone from red with anger to a waxy, corpse-like white. The foundation of his world, built on rank and regulation, had been shattered by a janitor's hidden history. He looked at Jedediah, truly looked at him for the first time. He didn't see an old, defiant worker. He saw the shadow of a warrior, a man who had walked through fire and come out the other side, choosing a life of quiet anonymity over medals and recognition. The weight of his own arrogance, his own monumental public stupidity, crashed down on him. He felt sick. He took a shaky step toward Jedediah, his bravado gone, replaced by a raw, desperate need to atone. "Sir," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "Sir, I had no idea. I'm so sorry, there's no excuse for my—" Jedediah simply raised a hand, stopping him. He looked the young lieutenant in the eye, and there was no anger, no triumph, only that same profound, ancient weariness. "The dust, Lieutenant," Jedediah said, his voice soft but clear. "It's bad for the turbines. Get the water truck." The lesson was delivered not with a shout, but with a quiet statement of fact. It was more devastating than any reprimand. Master Sergeant Hayes walked over, ignoring the humiliated lieutenant completely. He stopped in front of Jedediah, his weathered face etched with a deep, sincere respect. He didn't salute. The gesture would have been too formal, too public for a man who so clearly shunned the spotlight. Instead, he simply extended his hand. "Jedediah," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "My name is Tom Hayes. It's a genuine honor to meet you." Jedediah looked at the offered hand for a moment before taking it. His grip was surprisingly firm, the hand of a man who had worked hard his entire life. "Jed is fine, Master Sergeant," he replied, a faint smile returning to his face. Just Jed. The Pave Hawk crew insisted on getting a quick photo, a quiet, reverent affair by the side of the hangar. They gathered around the old man, their smiles genuine, their respect palpable. Jedediah looked uncomfortable, unused to being the center of attention, but he endured it with a quiet grace. Lieutenant Davis stood off to the side, alone and utterly broken, a pariah in the world he thought he commanded just minutes before. The water truck arrived, and the landing pad was quickly and properly cleaned under the watchful eye of Master Sergeant Hayes. The Pave Hawk crew said their goodbyes, each man shaking Jed's hand with a quiet word of thanks, before climbing back into their machine. As the black helicopter lifted off, kicking up a clean, dust-free wind, the PJ gave one last, sharp salute from the open door. Jedediah didn't salute back. He just gave a small wave, like a man seeing old friends off on a journey. The commotion died down as quickly as it had begun. The flight line returned to a state of nervous anticipation for the general, who would arrive on a clean landing pad, blissfully unaware of the drama that had preceded him. The airmen went back to their work. The MPs returned to their post. Lieutenant Davis was quietly relieved of his duties on the tarmac by Master Sergeant Hayes and told to report to the base commander's office. He walked away with the stiff, shuffling gait of a man heading to his own execution. Soon, Jedediah was alone again, just another anonymous figure against the vast, sun-bleached landscape of the airbase. He looked down at the broom lying on the ground. For a long moment, he just stared at it. It was a simple tool, a thing of wood and bristles. But in his hands, it was a shield, a cloak of invisibility he had chosen to wear. It was his piece. He bent down, his old joints protesting with a faint groan, and picked it up. He ran a calloused thumb over the smooth, worn wood of the handle. He could still hear the faint thumping of the Pave Hawk's blades receding into the distance, a sound that was as familiar and comforting to him as a lullaby. He turned and began to walk back toward the hangar, not with the hurried shame of a chastised worker, but with the slow, steady pace of a man who knew exactly who he was and was perfectly content with it. He started sweeping again, his movements once more methodical and precise, collecting the stray bits of gravel and debris that littered the concrete. He was just a janitor, after all, and there was work to be done.